to this third installment of our conversation series for the spring. So in the conversation is a series that we created to use the power of design of bridging different disciplines. And so in every conversation we touch a different area of research at Northeastern, and we had healthcare and design as part of the first installment, where we wanted to really get the patient perspective on stage, and we had a very fruitful conversation with stakeholders in the field. And then in the second installment, we went on design and AI. That is an incredibly hot topic at Northeastern, actually, for an NSF grant that we have at the Center for Design with the College of Engineering, the Mechanical Engineering School, and the Business School, Innovation Management. And then in this third installment, we change again a little bit topic, and we touch another strength of both, I would say, the College of Art, Media and Design and the Curie College of Computer Science, where data visualization is really something very important. I can quote a tweet of a friend, and cannot reveal the name, that says that Northeastern is becoming a powerhouse in data visualization, but maybe, I don't know if we have the proofs for that, but certainly we had some good hirings in the recent months around that topic. So it's really something that we are interested in discussing with people like the ones that Pedro Cruz brought today together. And we sorry, a little bit of a step back in the end of the fall series. We touched another interesting topic, that is data sonification, in a kind of a broad off-campus meeting on data sonification. And that was again another proof, if needed, if we need that, that there is a lot of attention around ways of transforming data that can create, enable richer experiences for different types of stakeholders. But that's all on my side. Here you have the names of all the panelists, but I'll leave to Pedro the stage to introduce them and to talk about the title that I really like about data visualization. Pedro, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you. I'm going to say that. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. And hi, everyone that are at home or remote, not necessarily at home. Thank you for coming. So my name is Pedro Cruz. I'm an assistant professor in art and design. I teach mostly information design, data visualization, and I have a background in information science and technology. We have three wonderful guests here with us. So I'm sure that you already know them, but I'm gonna just very briefly state their names. But before their names, I think I want to talk a little bit about the context of it. So I call this data visualization everywhere all at once because, well, they suggested that I should organize some sort of set of conversations. So I organized something that I would like for myself, right? And I wanted to have a feeling of how data vis is being applied nowadays. So it's about the utilitarian nature of things. So we have Melanie, who is I'm gonna get it, who is the director of research at the Roux Institute in Portland, Maine, she would be representing here visualization research and also a connection with industry. Maybe that's going to fly. All right. Yvonne, she's a full stack UX developer at the Roux Institute of MIT and Harvard, correct?
Yes.
And you are also an experienced design alumni.
I
am. From Eastern University. And here I was thinking that you could perhaps speak more to the side of tools for research and communication, right? So that was the idea of having you with us. And we have Ben Fry, who is the principal of Fathom Information Design and also lecturer at MIT on information design. Here, Ben, hopefully this is going to work. It's going to be more about design for multiple clients. So in the context of a design studio, right? So hopefully we'll have a little bit of that as well. So this is how I wanted to tie it all together. So I think it's really data visualization everywhere in all of these different axes, right? It's very literal and all at once because it's happening here. Right? It's very literal. There isn't, there isn't a catch up to all of it. All right, so we're going to start with a brief presentation from each of the panelists. So we're going to start with Melanie, then we're going to move to Yvonne, and then Ben, and then we're going to open it to a conversation. Okay, Melanie, the stage is yours.
All right. Is it better if I stand up?
So
Sure, you can do that. And you can all see me. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. So the title, Visualization Everywhere All at Once, I decided to entitle my topic, Visualization in the Wild, which is something that I have been studying as a researcher for some time. So you might have been confused by Pedro's introduction of like, I represent both research and industry, but I have actually been sort of flip-flopping and navigating the line in between those things through my career. When it comes back, you'll see sort of timeline where I started in academia, and then I moved into a sabbatical in Agilent Labs, and then I left academia and went to Tableau Software, where I worked both in kind of their academic research team, but also in the UX team as a professional user researcher. And now I have come to Northeastern as professor of the practice and leading visualization research at the Roux Institute, which is an interesting sort of agglomeration of research and industry all kind of mixed together with some startup accelerators. And it's an interesting and weird place where all these things kind of coalesce. So my perspectives kind of come from studying through research the ways that visualization is used out in the world in practice. So that's what I thought I'd share a little bit of with you today. So the question I've been trying to answer over several years of research is, how is visualization being used in practice to support decision making? And how could we as designers make changes or build new tools to better support practices to make them more fluid? So I come from an academic visualization discipline where researchers often have this mental model of a particular kind of data visualization work. There's maybe a little bit of an assumption that someone who's going to use data viz tools are going to sit down with a massive data set and maybe even a big giant wall of displays of multiple complex visualizations, and they're going to do analysis for several hours until they get insight, and then they'll do something with that. I want to counter that with how I've been seeing visualization used in the world in real practice, where it's often not that, right? It's often that people need to get a job done, and data is a part of that job, but maybe not even the primary part of the job. And data visualization kind of has to fit into their workflows of doing other things. And so those are the kinds of situations and environments that I've been studying over the last several years. So the reality I've been looking at is places in businesses, in nonprofits, where data is used to support decision making in kind of complicated, messy ways, where data dashboards and spreadsheets might be most people's kind of primary portals to data, and where data is a means to an end, but for most data workers, it's not their primary job. So how do these people work with data? What challenges do they encounter, and how could we better support them? So to answer those kinds of questions, I was involved in a series of studies. The first one was a dashboard study where we just tried to understand the different practices around data dashboards, like produced through things like business intelligence tools. And we did a survey of dashboards that were out on the web, and we did a survey of papers of how people were using dashboards. And then from there, I moved to a series of interview studies where I interacted or held interviews with people who were using dashboards or spreadsheets or other data tools in the world. And so the insights that I'm going to share with you kind of come from that series of study. So the kinds of people who I've been interacting with and interviewing, I'll just give you a couple of examples. Dustin, these are pseudonyms, by the way, not real names, but they are real people. Dustin was a fitness center manager. This guy who works at a sort of company fitness center. He's responsible for kind of managing memberships. And most of his day is in the fitness center, organizing equipment, talking to the people who come into the fitness center. But data is a part of his job in sort of monitoring membership numbers, predicting future membership numbers so he can predict revenues and maybe decide how much equipment he can afford to buy in the coming year, things like this. He does a lot of what if analysis, like, well, what if in January, everybody, we get 30% extra enrollment because of all of the New Year's resolutions, that would change my revenue by so much, and then I would have excess amounts. So yes, I can probably afford to purchase this new piece of equipment. And then he produces monthly reports for his manager. Another example was Miguel. Miguel was a talent acquisition director working in HR in a large company. And he uses data in his job to track things like diversity and inclusion data for employees. And he was actually really interesting because he used Tableau dashboards on his phone, and he would bring his phone into meetings and project from his phone onto a wall display, and would kind of actively slice and dice the data in the course of a meeting with his staff. And a lot of his theme around data was about storytelling. It wasn't just about digging into the answers. It was all about how he could tell a story to the company about not just the numbers, but what they really mean and what kind of decisions maybe they should be making and why. So some of the things that, I'll just highlight a couple of top level themes. One is that dashboards were a lot of folks' primary portal to data. Like the dashboard was the place they would go to get the data, because the data was buried in, complicated cloud systems and databases that they didn't have the skills or permissions to go and access directly. So the way they get their data is from the dashboard. And while as dashboard designers, we might think that that's sort of the endpoint, that they would do everything in a dashboard. In fact, for many of them, the dashboard was just the starting place. It's like, I go get my data from the dashboard, and then I can do stuff with it. And since I can't do anything in a dashboard, which is kind of a static, inflexible display, what they would do is dump the data out of the dashboard and then work with it in Excel. So we saw a whole lot of data dumping out of business intelligence tools into Excel so that people could actually work with it in flexible ways. So this, what actually people are using day to day, spreadsheets or other forms of rich tables. And there's a lot of really interesting reasons why they like to use those things, right? One of the reasons is that you can format the data in whatever way you want, in a way that is human readable. It doesn't have to be in a nice, tidy format that a database can read. You can annotate it. You can add marginality. Again, marginality, you can just like make notes around it. You can organize it. You can highlight it. And you can think about the data not in sort of abstractions of like field names like business unit, but rather by looking at just individual cells. Like, I know what this cell means. I can interpret that as a concrete thing. So there's a lot of sort of tangibility in the design of a spreadsheet that is a really rich and interesting way for people to interact with their data. And I would love if we could take some of that tangibility and flexibility of the spreadsheet and sort of infuse it into the visualization tools we're providing. Another big theme out of this was sort of that a lot of the practices we saw were what I would call seamful experiences. In design, we often go for seamlessness. We want things to be fluid. We want things to be straightforward and simple. And instead, it was sort of a kludge of, you start with it. For example, you might start in a dashboard. dump the data out, look at it in a spreadsheet, do your work there. Again, dump the data out to make a presentation or a report for your manager. And these seams between different tools were in no way designed. They were just sort of accidental and often clumsy and complicated. And maybe as designers, we could really think through that whole process and design for it. And that would be amazing. All right, so I think that we have an opportunity as visualization experts to think about how people really work and kind of go and meet them where they are, right? We could do things like make data dashboards, but make them more flexible so that people could kind of change which fields are shown to answer new questions, or maybe do a little what if analysis in the context of the dashboard. So maybe that data doesn't have to get dumped out to other tools so often. We could support transitions between activities of analysis and things like data sharing or presentation that are often part of the workflow people go through. And we could maybe adopt some of the flexibility and materiality that you get in a spreadsheet that, that is really valuable to people, and maybe find ways to infuse that into our visualization tools. So kind of with that in mind, some of the new directions I'm going, one is around situated visualization. So again, sort of in the theme of meeting people where they are, a lot of people are doing work in very physical environments. That could be a hospital or a factory or a train station, but where things are, there are physical things going on in their workflows. And so now I'm starting to think about, well, how do we design for those kinds of scenarios where you're not just an analyst looking at a computer screen, but actually you're doing work in the world. And now we want to think about how to bring data to that rather than making you go to the data. I'm also thinking a whole lot about AI these days, as I'm sure many of us are, and how visualization and AI can kind of interplay with each other, and how AI can be used as a window to give some explainability and transparency to AI systems, again, in many of these kind of real world scenarios and environments. So that's me, that's what I'm thinking about, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, thank you. Yvonne, when you can.
Yes, I'm gonna,
Good time.
okay. Let me get into here. We're gonna go into presenter view.
Can we pass the mic to
Yes.
Yes, I'm gonna kind of remain seated, but face this way. Then I'll turn my camera on so that you know I'm not a robot. Here I am. Hello, people on the screen. So yeah, hi, I'm Yvonne Blanco. I'm a full stack UX UI designer. I've done scientific illustration. I've done basically all the things. I'm representing Pattern at the Roux Institute. And just to give you a bit of a background, I have my BFA from RISD, and I've just got a master's here at Northeastern. Super awesome. I've been in scientific illustration for 11 years. I then shifted over to the Roux Institute as a multimedia and then UX UI designer. And now I'm with Pattern. And then on the personal side, I'm a proud Cuban from Miami, Florida. I do interdisciplinary art in my spare time. I write for UX Bootcamp, and I love cats and heavy metal. So now you know. So what am I getting you into right now? So I want to give you all a slice of knowledge on what it's like to design for scientists. It's been my whole career. There's a couple little things to keep in mind. I'm going to show you a selection of work from Cell Press and the Data Sciences platform. And then I'm going to end with some selections from my team over at the Broad. So I get a lot of emails from people saying, your job is so cool. I want to do scientific illustration. How do I get your job? And the first thing I always tell them is that designing for scientists, it is a niche. It's a it's a niche, very small. So once you're in, if you spend any amount of time in there, it's very hard to get out. Your options are very limited. So make sure you really love it, because you're probably going to be doing it for the rest of your life. And then the second thing, there's two universal challenges, regardless of where you are in science. And I've worked in various disciplines within the scientific realm. There's two universal challenges that always pop up. The first is how scientists think. They think that everything is happening all the time at the same time forever. And it's true. Cellular processes do not exist in a vacuum. They're just kind of multifaceted in the fourth dimension. Everything's catalyzing something else. It's a lot. And this could lead to information overload. So knowing how to work with a scientist to synthesize that information, to be able to show what the real meat of what the research is always a challenge and happens in every realm of science. The second is the eternal struggle between integrity and relatability, and how this is how science is communicated. And I'll dip into that real quick. But first, this is what I'm talking about when everything is happening all the time forever. This is a diagram on neoangiogenesis. I did not do this, someone else published it. But it's very hard to tell what's going on because there's so many things and all of them are important, but they're not really leveraging design to be able to get the meat that all of these things catalyze the formation of blood vessels around a tumor. And now we get to the second challenge, is the spectrum of integrity and relatability. So when you're designing for science, there's this, you're within this spectrum. And on the far left, it's intelligence, scientific integrity, and authority. And there's visual conventions that go with this. You know, a lot of scientific things, they're gray. There's a lot of jargon. It's all, you know, everything's going on all the time. It's a little hard to discern if you're not in the field. And then on the far right, you get relatability, you get levity and entertainment. And science that tends to be communicated in this realm is almost disregarded because the language is simple, it's fun, it's enjoyable, but it doesn't feel scientific. So most of the communications exist on this end of the spectrum, you know, is basically like 60, 70%. And then on this end, you get things like IFL science, you get your science influencers, and they're not taken as seriously as something on the far left. And so ideally, when you're designing scientific communications, you want to be in the center. You want to have that integrity, a perfect balance between the two, integrity and entertainment relatability. But you will get pushed more so to the left because it has to, you know, integrity like outweighs the relatability. So it is your challenge to try to get back into that little center there. Let's talk about cell-press. So I was a illustrator designer for 11 years, and everyone saw the you know, everything's going on in that figure. Figures would come into us. They look like spaghetti, and it's our job to basically make sense of them. And I have 3 principles for when I design these information, you know, it's essentially information design, but we want to take that scientific research, we want to maintain the integrity, but we also want it to be legible, we want it to be aesthetic, and we want it to be cohesive. So each one of these is a completely different process. They exist in their own world, and you can pretty much see, you know, sequentially what's going on in them. There are other larger, these snapshots, which is a more kind of complicated process. So, you know, multiply the other things times 10. It's the same challenge. It's just a different format, and it's just a different area of science that we're communicating. And then another cool thing here is I got to do a lot of covers, and these are more editorial. They're metaphorical. This was, you know, this is where I had my fun, you know, and that gray, that left side, this is where I got into the right side. So that was a very cool aspect of it. From there, I got recruited to the Broad, and I worked with the user education platform. And so basically, it's a platform that is dedicated to genomic analysis, which is very complex. So you have to make sure your education is, you know, your users are being educated on how to use it. And the user education team is cranking out, you know, documentation after documentation. So one of the things I did was set up the system so that they can make diagrams that would visually aid in people using our genomics analysis software. And so, you know, we're running into the same problem here, where this is now genomic analysis on the cloud. Everything is still happening at the same time all the time. So here's a before and after of, you know, kind of cleaning up this research. The 2 slides convey the same thing. One of them is just easier to digest. And then the other part was creating tutorials, and I did a lot of like the editing, the recording, and we have a YouTube channel where you can go to learn how to use this software. Then I transferred into UX UI, and the first project was Terra. So this is the counterpart to the actual platform that allows you to analyze software. It's a 24-page outreach site, has resources, has materials for enterprise. And we built it in 2 months, which I do not recommend. I'm not going to go through the whole process, but it was very much a start to finish, full stack, gather the resources, make the lo-fi, hi-fi, iterate. And at the very end, we had 24 pages in 2 months, just in time for a partnership announcement. And that was pretty great. So that led me to joining Duos. Duos is, we're talking about data. Duos is about data access and data governance. So the data that you're using in your visualization has to be categorized and has to have certain permissions. And the process of accessing that, researchers need to access, there's a committee that says yes or no. The whole thing takes a very long time. So I got assigned to Duos and basically just making a lot of forms when you're requesting the data and a lot of consoles to keep track of where it is in approvals and for committee members to vote on them. And as you can see, it is a pretty convoluted process. We had to figure that out and streamline that. But ultimately, what we ended up with was taking something that's very cumbersome, that has a lot of things, and simplifying it, making it clean, making it easy to use, to cut down that time from when the researcher says, I need the data, and when the access committee says, you may has the data. So that's Duos in a nutshell. You can visit both of them. Here's where we get to what you actually came here for. This is the work from Pattern. So Pattern, we are a team at the Roux Institute. We are interdisciplinary designers, we're engineers, we're scientists. We come together to specialize in data visualization. We mostly make tools, and they fall in the realm of decision making, as you were talking before, and generative. And so the projects from my colleagues, Ben and Duyen, I'll show you a couple of theirs, and we'll end with the one that I'm working on right now. And so this is the GTEx portal. This is Duyen's project. And so it's basically for researchers who are studying the effects of variants on gene expression in adult and human tissues. And so how we support them is by doing setting up the tool and doing the UX UI design to set the stage for people to come in and use the visualization. So here we have a violin plot. This is showing the expression of a single gene across all tissues that we have data for. And so this helps researchers get a sense of the data distribution based off the shape of the violin. So that one in the muscle, like that's a lot of expression. So you're going to want to investigate that a bit further. The second project from Duyen is Genomics to Proteins portal. And so this aggregates genomic, transcriptomic, and proteomic data. That's a lot of omics into one large resource. And so that way, our researchers can discover the impact of genetic variants on both the protein sequence and the structures. You have DNA, you end up with proteins. There's some interesting stuff there. And here's a visualization from that tool. Basically, this is an example of a protein feature viewer for a gene that someone might look up in the portal. The transcription, and you're looking at the final product that's created by the transcription, translation of the gene. And so, it's flagged in several areas. And, to answer these questions, is it residue specific? Is a specific residue positive, negative? What is the molar mass? Things about protein structure, which residues make up a helix, beta strand, or the 3D protein structure. So it's a lot of information that scientists can use to then further investigate and fuel their research. The next one, this is kind of a fun one. This is Ben's project. This is the microbiome data portal in collaboration with CMIT. It combines multiple data sets from studies that visualize bacteria diversity. And so here, this is set up to look at the abundance of every sample in this particular study. It's grouped by disease state, and then, you know, the visual encodings, the color and the size kind of designate its abundance, and you could get a bit extra information on that. And these are all, you know, kind of IBS, like gut microbiome related diseases. This is another view from the microbiome data portal. So this is showing a univariate analysis between two population groups. So here you could see, you know, the relationships between the abundance, the presence, and the statistical significance of these bacterium. And so here's the final one. So this project I was brought in to work on. This is the cancer dependency map. And so it's basically helping our researchers accelerate cancer therapeutics, which is very close to my heart, by mapping the vulnerabilities across all tumors. So this that we're looking at right now, and there's a lot of stuff going on here, just so you know, following with that theme, is the gene overview page. So this would, when you look up a gene, this gives you anything and everything you could ever want to know about a gene that's going to inform the analyses that you are going to perform with the tools that are located. And you can visit that map portal. We have two tools right now that are available. The first one is Cell Liner. And so this helps researchers select cell lines that would mostly resemble a tumor type of interest. So it's kind of grouped by lineage and tissue type, and you can go in and see which lines of interest like you would like to pursue further. So this is very much a generative tool. The second is Data Explorer. I'm currently working on Data Explorer 2, but I cannot show you that because it hasn't been released yet and I will get fired. So let's not do that. Let's look at Data Explorer 1. So here, it's creating a scatter plot. So it mostly investigates relationships. This one's showing MTAP expression, which is a factor in predicting cancer, and PMRT5. And that's a gene that plays a role. And so what you're looking at is you're plotting them on axes, and you're finding relationships and identifying outliers or targets of interest that you may want to explore further. So, you know, that map essentially generative. And that's what I have for you. There's a lot more, but you know, I'll be here forever and you guys don't want that. You can find us on the web. You can find us on Twitter if you have anything further. And, you know, thank you so much for having me here.
Maybe should I try and stand up there? Is that I was gonna.
Yeah.
We're on?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Great. So I can see you all now. Interesting for the panel here. So I run a studio over in Boston since 2010. We've been at it, and basically trying to put into practice this idea of, you know, what can you do when you have information design going all the way from raw data and building the backend systems to support you know, what you're doing over on the front, all the way through to how users are using it on the other side of that. And the other, perhaps, you need some echo here. The other everything everywhere all at once thing is we've also been doing a lot of scientific work over the last couple of years. So now we have more science. So I hope everyone's up for science days today. This, you know, so for example, this was a project that we did with a lab at Stanford, the Marcus Covert Lab for Systems Bio. Sort of a vague video, I apologize. This was unpublished work when we had put it together. but essentially they had built a software model of how a cell works, and you could basically take different parts of the cell and look at sort of run data through that and be able to see how different parts of the cell are actually interacting with each other, find interesting correlations between, so one thing fires, that makes something else fire, that makes something else fire. Oh, I didn't expect that thing to sort of upregulate or something like that. And what this was able to do is really kind of change the process of how those researchers were actually working. So we're not out to necessarily, make them do something differently, but the more that we can actually get involved in their work process and hopefully sort of give them a nice leap forward, that is always something that we're after, that we're interested in. Also that our competition here was either looking at log files that were tens of thousands of lines long and using Command F to just look for particular things of interest, or that if you were somebody in their group who actually understood how to write some Python, you would actually sit down and do some code and kind of build these things out. But literally, when they first got this working, the way that they identified that it was working was that they printed out sort of a binder like this of just log file data, kind of like this is what's going on, and FedExed it to their PI, who is at a conference at the time. So he gets at the hotel and he kind of like going through it page by page. So hopefully we built them something more useful than that. On the research side, we had a set of work that we were doing. We were asked to look at basically, so this was actually with some folks at DARPA, where so DARPA funds all this different research, and over time it's important to understand sort of what's actually been funded, and so people can actually have that for context. But as is typical for these sort of data management systems, it's this sort of roach motel, like the data goes in and never comes back out. That you do all these different reports and presentations and things like that. And so at the when they first engaged with us, they had sort of 250 to 350,000. They couldn't actually tell us the exact number of these reports, but no good way of actually understanding sort of what's there. And so typically when you're trying to organize this sort of thing, either you have to be extremely anal retentive and like set up all the right metadata and put everything in just the right folder and whatever, and you still make mistakes, or you kind of give up and you do say, we'll do search. I don't know. And hopefully there's something a little bit more in between that we can do that is a little bit more useful. Our first take on this was, okay, let's take 1 million journal articles from the PubMed database, and can we start looking at terms and kind of how they group together and whatever. This one's a little rough. We get a nice history thing of over time looking at a particular term. We could see the spike in genetics articles coming up. Here's the draft of the Human Genome Project finishing, and then so it's all genetics these days. That one was kind of not a great way of kind of getting more depth or layers to that data. So we instead try to look at, let's do topic modeling. So this is taking 5.5 million articles from Wikipedia. So the entire Wikipedia English data set, running topic modeling on it, and then interactively being able to take those topic modeling groups and just go from this high level picture of here's what sort of the cartography of Wikipedia looks like from from the top level, and then just being able to go down layer by layer by layer. So we've got 500,000 articles here, 676,000 articles that are school, university, college, national. So we're talking about universities and things. Here, obviously, it's cities, states, townships, municipalities of different kinds, and so so interesting. Like the interaction we enjoyed. So it feels nice to kind of move through sort of panel by panel with this. But it also loses that nice thing about Wikipedia as far as you're at an article and then you try another article and then you try another one and then like half an hour goes by and you've learned all kinds of interesting things, but may have forgotten what you were doing. So in an attempt to kind of get some of that back, we actually turned to an illustrator who was working with us at the time and was in the office and said, look, what happens if we actually just take kind of a slice of Wikipedia and make a poster out of that? What happens if we, sort of bit by bit, just kind of construct what this looks like, purely by hand instead of doing anything overly algorithmic with it. And things break down into these main 6 categories. And then she just went through and took a series of articles that were characteristic for those particular topics. And it gets, it really kind of gets that nice texture of kind of all of the weirdness that you get from Wikipedia, and just, the strange adjacencies of things, and being able to, but still kind of having this sort of cartographic feel for, well, this article is kind of near this one, which is also kind of near this one, and starts telling you something a little bit about that structure of the data set as you're moving through it. So this was a fun, sort of poster exercise, just to, use that to drive some, how we were thinking about the rest of it. We really were, trying to figure out like what, again, sort of the cartography of documents, like looking at this broader range of items. Let's see if this one will run for me. So here, looking at, it's doing a different algorithmic layout here. This is using t-SNE. Same type of thing as far as doing topic modeling. So we have, war, king, army are different topics within this document set. City, island area is this, region here. For Wikipedia, it looks like this, and you can really see some of, visual art is over near museums, which is near schools. And then Christianity, Judaism, law, myths, religion, poetry, so these interesting sort of adjacencies that pretty much kind of sort of make sense. But then also, aside from just algorithmically, like this is, some of this layout we're essentially getting from the algorithm, but how do we actually navigate this? It's much more interesting if we can say, now I want to move into different sections of this, this sort of space, and be able to refine further by, so here's all the cancer-related documents. We'll click into one of them. Let's click into one of them. So we'll click into one of them and actually see the shape sort of rearrange based on just giving us a layout for that particular set of documents, and then be able to go, successively further down through it, and individually, there we go, being able to select individual documents. So some interesting research, some ideas kind of rolling around about how to interact with a large document set, how to think about the cartography of it. Still a bit of an unfinished thing. And here we're getting down to sort of a smaller set, and actually down to particular articles. Let's see. So for the last couple of years, we've had this pandemic thing happening, and we, for many years, have been putting grant applications together with some partners over that we worked with over the road, Party Saveti and her lab. And basically, she's been dealing with, she's done, SARS and Ebola and Zika and MERS, and just, these different, in kind of waiting for the next pandemic to happen. And for years, kind of saying, look, we need to actually build infrastructure for, how do we deal with pandemics when they have, before they happen. And so that we're more ready for it. And that's sort of a detection thing. That's a how do you respond to it thing. So as part, and so ironically enough, funding for that came through finally after about 8 years, January of 2020, just before stuff happened. And one piece of that work that we have been building is this a tool called Lookout, which takes sort of given an organization, institution, we have a set of people. We want to bring in a lot of different information about. In this case, we're looking more at the understanding the ongoing situation on at a location. So in this case, we're looking at a university. We have 10,000 students. This is a university in Colorado, and basically trying to get them back safely and on campus. And so our first view here is pretty dashboardy. This is kind of the whoever's in charge of this tracking this information. They're going to sit down with this. It can be very detailed because they're looking at this day to day. But it's things like cases and how clearance is actually going. Test completed this week. Where it actually starts getting interesting is looking at these groups. So a pandemic or an infectious disease outbreak is not a story of individual people. It is about how people interact with each other. And so the more that we can actually start looking at things like, oh, this person is positive and they're in the swim team. This other person is positive and they're in the swim team, and they share a dorm room with somebody on the water polo team. And so on you go, and you can start seeing some of these connections. And that's something that data-wise, that's really quite invisible, right? And so how do you make that more self-evident? Also did wastewater testing so that, one of the interesting things the students actually set up, between the bio department and the mechanical engineering department, did a whole wastewater testing system themselves to, feed into this. This is another spot where it starts getting more interesting. So we, given actual test samples, we can take the DNA from the, positive COVID tests that come back and see where those show up on a phylogenetic tree. So basically looking at the relationship between each of those samples. And then also here in orange, we're looking at other samples in the neighborhood. So like elsewhere in Colorado there. And so be able to take that as a tree. And so literally we can see spread. And so we can say things like, are we looking at this mild outbreak being one introduction or two? But it also is kind of taking what is normally a, something that you're doing in a paper 6 months later after the outbreak happens, and hopefully pushing that much earlier into the process to when it's actually useful for people to make decisions based on it on campus. Also getting into the outbreak clusters and different groups and be able to sort of manage resources that way. We also had actual layout of dorms, so we can literally say, this person is sick, these two people have been tested, let's make sure we're able to test those last three. And so important considerations around resources and allocation and so forth. We got a nice times piece out of it. This is these are the students with their like sort of makeshift wastewater testing stuff, and they would kind of skateboard around campus, like taking their all their samples and then sort of feed it into the system. And fundamentally, a lot of what we're doing is sketching and just trying different kinds of things, so that lookout tool is much part of a much larger effort for, how do we deal with some of these things, like, with a mobile device, how do we do just right on the phone? That was true. Sorry, there's my dramatic flourish apparently. Yeah, so being able to test samples, take that in on a phone, what does that interface look like? This was a sort of 1 or 2 week project that we did to help them be able to bring everyone on campus, bring parents on campus, so that they could see graduation, which basically involved everyone coordinating, doing PCR COVID tests for every single parent who's going to be joining. And so we did a whole system for quickly checking people in to make sure that they had the test. Sometimes it's just getting good data, so quick reporting on mobile. The tools for looking at cases, that not particularly useful. Everyone, all the newspapers had kind of, oh, the cases are going up, oh, the cases are going down, and not particularly, here trying to tie that to neighborhoods and information that might be more relevant than just sort of these global things. We've seen a lot of maps, sort of colored based on, how many tests or how many cases do we have in New York, and how many cases do we have in Michigan? And basically we're looking at population density maps. And instead, let's try and render those maps and render that data taking population density into account, so we can actually get a sense of, oh, so here's where more of those cases actually are, and we're talking about the 95 corridor essentially. And then finally, something we've been looking at more recently, just so if you have, we've heard about these different variants going around, Omicron and Delta and XBB.1.5 and so on, and because new variants are being introduced, day to day, week to week, month to month. Given what about one particular variant, for researchers working with this data, how do you sort of understand, a new variant in that context? So how do you use what from a previous variant and be able to see, sort of changes? So this was, even just a basic version of, let's see, these are all the different mutations across particular lineages. So we've got Omicron up top, and BJ1, BM1, XBB15, XBB. And so we're able to see just, so what's similar and different. And then we're coloring things based on, these are genes that have higher scores for fitness or how quickly they're changing. But then also a little bit more fun is we actually mix some warm colors in there and be able to much more clearly see, oh, how is this guy different from this guy? And so we are able to see that much more clearly, oh, this is something very important that's happening, so not all of these changes between all these lineages are actually created equal. And so how do you, use what we know about color and things to really kind of bring that forward and be able to see more of that in context. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so this was great, a lot of great work and a lot went back here. Maybe, just to start things off, maybe we can revisit that beautiful spectrum that Yvonne showed us on the push for scientific, and maybe I want to know, so I want to learn more about that, and I want to know whether Ben and Melanie experienced something like that. And what are we talking about when you talk about that spectrum and the push for scientific, and what is on the other side?
Yeah, so what I was talking about is how are you presenting the information? And it's more, visuals and tones. So because scientific information has that rigor, has that authority, it is presented in the same way that kind of reinforces, you have that psychological association, it reinforces that this is something, it's scientific, it's fact, it's matter. And moving into the other side where things are presented, with entertainment, bright colors, kind of fluffy, kind of bouncy. It's in direct conflict with that kind of, visual language. So it's not taking as seriously, even though the content matter could be the same. It's not taken as seriously. It's not as respected because the visual language is not the same. And they tend to prefer that kind of gray, clinical, sterile, visual way of presenting, and it's been kind of from the work I showed at Cell and whatnot, I've been trying to push into, well, it can be aesthetic, it can be fun, it can be just nice to look at while still being informative, while still being rooted in that scientific integrity.
Ben, have you?
A lot. And maybe two specific anecdotes on that. One, one of the researchers, actually, this was back, I did a postdoc at the Broad, and while working on a particular tool, had just done some really kind of basic the graphic design stuff to kind of clean things up so that it doesn't just kind of hurt your eyes when you're looking at it and using it. And even with that basic work, one of the responses I actually got from one of my allies was, "It's too pretty. I don't feel like I'm doing science." And that's even with the really basic, sort of stuff. And it's this is one of, and so that's very much a thing. And then another maybe sort of counter anecdote to that that I found interesting. One of my coworkers, Mark, his wife is a researcher over at UMass Boston, and one of the things that she said about the relationship for scientists to, diagrams that have the gray, whatever, essentially the just came out of Excel sort of feels with it, and that part of what is relatable for that is that their understanding of, they know the path to how that diagram. So they've seen enough diagrams like that. They've made enough of those diagrams themselves to know, it has its own sort of separate visual language to it that they are extremely familiar with. And so part of the veracity comes from, they've seen 1,200 other, terrible Excel charts or whatever, but they know exactly kind of what the trade-offs were for how that particular shitty Excel chart was arrived at. And so, which I think is really, so that's something that we're kind of processing at the moment is like, like how do you kind of bridge that a little bit? Like the thing I showed at the very end with the colors, it's kind of like, it's a lot of color, like, and so we actually added that separate version that just has the blue at the beginning as kind of like a, hey, let's, like, we're highlighting different things that are more important and whatever. And then like before we introduce the warm colors so that they don't like, it's red and it's blue, and so visually it just feels very different from a lot of the stuff that folks might be used to. So always a significant balance, even things like putting things in a white background versus a black background, that the lookout tool that I showed with sort of doing the campus stuff. I think there are a lot of the researchers that we work with who don't actually feel like that's real because it looks very sci-fi or something like that. And it's like, we probably just need to do a light mode for it so that it's like, no, it's real. It's actual science numbers, etc. So, so some of these things can be very superficial.
On that note, do you find that this has to reflect or tends to be a reflection of very audience, or this idea that aesthetics cannot also be intelligent? And in doing so, like one of the things I struggle as a freelance designer is trying to create a product that clients like, a product that I think is good. And how do you push your own personal agenda, your own personal beliefs, also please clients?
I think an immediate thing that we tend to try and do is build an initial thing that kind of meets them where they are and kind of starts fixing some of the basic issues that we're dealing with, and is close to working inside of their visual language and kind of what they're familiar with, and that has the dual purpose. And then separately, try and do another round to say, and here's where we would actually like to go with it, and it's important to have. It's helpful to have both because, for one, it gives you a lot more knowledge about how to build the one that's kind of rethinking things a bit, but also hopefully gives them a little bit of a bridge to go from one to the next. The huge downside to that, outside of doing twice as much work, is that if the initial one is being sort of incrementally better, that can also get rejected because it's only incrementally better. So there's sort of this like weird dance of like, okay, it needs to be different enough for it to be compelling enough for people to use, but it also needs to be similar enough that it's not rejected out of hand. So that's a very difficult thing to jump.
Melanie, have you found that in your work as well?
It's interesting because I've worked mostly in business intelligence kinds of contexts, where a lot of the visualization design is self-service, right? So using business intelligence tools or even just Excel to produce the graphics that are shared. And there you definitely find them like more on the clinical, standard, boring end of design. But I don't know how much is driven by either enforced design standards that the organization has created to ensure some consistency, and how much is created by the limitations of the self-service tools that there's only so much flexibility you have within a business intelligence tool. There's really no facility to customize in more creative ways than we are imagining. And that's actually maybe an opportunity is how we would enable that. So I don't know how much are those constraints versus people's inherent tendency to be towards the more scientific or rigorous or somehow business-like aesthetic.
But for example, I would say that Tableau in industry brought an aesthetic that, in my point of view, goes in the right direction. Right, so it's not it's not simply what you get from Excel. You have more compelling visualization models within Tableau, and even the color that you can select there and picking color palettes in there, right? So I think it's possible that even in a business intelligence setting to go in that direction, right?
Yeah.
Step by step, right? Because you don't want to shock
A little bit
people,
at a
right?
time.
Yeah. Kim.
Yeah, thank you so much. Super interesting. I think this is mainly to Melanie, but also probably to all of you. A lot of the terms you use triggered like things for me, like when somebody writes me an email saying dashboard, that's the best way of not getting a reply from myself. So
Right.
I'm like very much on the other side. But it's also seamlessness. It's a term that I've been thinking about quite a lot. And wondering about. There's an advert from Apple where basically a kid is playing around with her iPad the entire day. And then at the end of the ad, like one of the parents is asking, what are you doing on your computer all day long? And the girl says, what is a computer? So the idea is that it's so interwoven and so in there. It's like a new version of it just works. It's just there and you don't have to think about it. And I think this is a huge trend in technology that like we're hiding the infrastructure. We don't know where signals go, what they do. We're just like hiding these things away and make it more and more seamless. So to like getting that out of the, and I think design is like a big part of that. Design is the thing that's doing that. So, and I'm like coming from like a media theoretical view, there is this idea that you actually see the things like what they do when they break, when they don't function. So, and I'm wondering if there might be, maybe there's something good about that people just like copy and paste those numbers into Excel and make their own things. And so like to get to my question, like I'm wondering about like design and seamlessness. And at the same time, like power and authority, like to what extent do you make people like do certain things and take decisions by the designs that we give them?
So you make a couple of really interesting points. I love the way you've captured seamlessness, right? That like it almost just disappears. You aren't even thinking about, you aren't thinking about the seams if they don't exist, if they've disappeared. And that's really what we want as designers. Your point about empowerment by sort of copying and pasting those numbers is something we saw in some of these studies. And I'll give you an example. There was a woman I interviewed who was kind of tracking her art sales, her online art sales, and doing a lot of this work manually, right? Like she would manually record the numbers into tables. Instead of, using the spreadsheet function to add them up, she'd actually use her calculator. Like there was a ton of manual labor steps. But as she described it, it was empowering to her to do that, right? She understood how to do her work that way. It was tangible to her. It made sense to her, and it enabled her to wrap her head around what the numbers were telling her. And so there was, even though as a computer person, I could see those steps as kind of inefficient and, maybe there are better ways to go about it. But at the same time, it was incredibly empowering to someone to be able to take ownership and do things in a sort of tangible, stepwise way that makes sense to you. And so we don't want to lose that in going towards seamlessness.
Thank you all very
just important to kind of meet people where they are and like making that decision about like, yeah, keep your Excel spreadsheet, enjoy. Like, you know, red means that thing for you, and that they have their own sort of system to it, and knowing which things actually give you a better way of doing that, because there are other things that you can actually augment or improve by including it. But it was an interesting sort of a way of kind of addressing the flexibility of that without having to overbuild, essentially.
I'm curious how you address this sort of ensuring consistency of that data in your spreadsheet, because that can be,
There's a lot of
ongoing problem.
error checking code that's in there too.
Right.
And we had, you know, there's a little bit of manual, like, let's refresh it for today kind of stuff in there. And, you know, but it was enough. We got it to a point where it worked reasonably well. In other cases, we actually have a separate project that we were doing with that. It's a, you know, database of 2,000 different releases that a BAS basis is played on. And in that case, they were doing a Google Sheet that multiple people were editing. And it was such a disaster that we wound up just building the tool and saying, we're going to build this tool and kind of lock that down a little bit more because it was so much more freeform. In the former case, it was, he was really good about keeping his spreadsheet very clean and was, you know, just, this is essential. And he was, you know, making it happen.
So I go between business and science, and I think I'm on like a lot of that. And the problem that's coming around was the simplicity of that.
Problems, challenges. That's awesome. Challenges I'm facing currently with that map is that there is that bias. It is essentially a tool built by scientists for scientists. So it is only intuitive to about 9% of the population, and like, you know, very targeted scientists. So we are doing user studies and people are coming in, and it's, you have to know exactly what you're doing to get the best out of the tool. It's not very intuitive. There's not a lot of hand holding. And where the seamlessness gets interrupted is, let's say you're looking up graph and you're like, okay, so here's this gene. What do I do now? And now they have to go back and forth to try to figure out what exactly are they supposed to do. And so, you know, as we move forward to solve that issue, you know, there has to be that right balance of, you know, instruction without being overbearing, but also that element of discovery and, you know, using visual cues to get people to navigate to parts and be able to know more. So yeah, it's
part of the fun is like making it simple enough that it's accessible to non-domain experts and being able to dig as deep as they need to.
Yeah.
So, boiling the ocean.
I'm not sure if this is answering your question, Lucy, but part of what I see is a kind of
Frame the question, please, for the audience.
I think the question was around the tensions in organizations between the need for people to be flexible and the need for some sort of standardization in numbers. At least that's a piece of it that I heard. And I'm seeing that kind of tension, right? That the central business intelligence or IT teams tend to want to be very careful. They want to ground truth data. They want to make sure everyone's using the same numbers. They want to make sure that people are calculating metrics the same consistent way and getting the right ones that they're making decisions on. And the people who are using those numbers want flexibility in how they do their analysis. And those things are kind of a little bit in one another, which is part of where the seamless comes in. But perhaps I didn't fully capture your question there.
Well, that's it. That goes well with what Yvonne was covering. Yeah.
Yeah.
Separate.
I'm just wondering, like, it's also possible that one experience won't satisfy really diverse user types. So like, it's not that scientists wanting high information density and what we're considering crummy charts is wrong. It's maybe just right for them. So is it possible that we need to think about variations of experiences that are tuned to different types of users? Is that something you guys experience a bit? You know?
As much as possible, because I think it's well, where in some ways that actual last bit of interpretation is a much smaller part of the problem than figuring all of it out and what are we actually trying to do and how do we interact with it and where does the data go, and you know, and so that the with any luck, when you that last mile of what does it actually look like and what is included, and you know, things like that, sort of the things that people tend to think of, oh, that's visualization. It's like, actually, there's all this other stuff behind it. That it's a lot easier to sort of swap out different versions of that. And as much as possible, we want to have some of those variants available. And so then it becomes a question of like identifying useful variants, right? You know, so are there two more drastic holes that we can address, or is it there's 3 different people, or you know what that looks like?
So I found very interesting I am from like scientific entertaining one. I'm working in the field of digital humanities, so I create visualizations of like cultural archives, like photographic archives and libraries and stuff like that. And there is a lot of discussion going on because people find it problematic if visualizations are like too scientific, because the data that is visualized, you know, comes from an archive, and an archive decides what is part of the data, like what becomes archived and what not. And it's obviously that, you know, certain parts of the population are not equally represented in these archives than others. So people think it's problematic if it's visualized in a scientific way, because it kind of reinforces the stereotypes that are inherent in these cultural archives and kind of make them credible and believable. And so I'm interested in like finding ways that, you know, try to go around that. So I'm interested if you made experience with working with such data sets where our clients, you know, that requested that they want to have it messy and they want to have ambiguity and all that stuff. And how do you handle that?
Yeah, I think it's hard because you have to get that buy-in for having an overview. And you probably experienced this where, you know, simplifying at a top level to then be able to show more in depth so you're not overloaded with information. They will fight you on that. So it's like trying to help them be okay with the baseline overview and not think that that is the full representation of the work that they're presenting. It does take a lot. It's kind of like pulling teeth, but it's like once you get to that agreement of we can have that top level overview and it is totally okay, and then go further, then that's when, you know, it starts to get better, and then you can really push that more relatability angle of the information you're trying to present. But it is a struggle.
Yep.
You mentioned, you know, like extracting data from something that is like already visualized, which I find very interesting. And is some of your proposal like being able to extract that data once it's visualized, and how would you go about that?
Yeah, what I was seeing was that often dashboards were produced in organizations not as sort of the analytical tool, but just as the data delivery mechanism, right? It was all about getting the right data or metrics to the right people who needed them, hopefully in largely the format they needed to answer some questions, but often in such an inflexible way that if they had more questions than what was directly anticipated, they couldn't do it. And so I guess part of what I'm proposing is greater flexibility in those kinds of dashboards so that they become more like interactive,
exploratory visualizations that just have a starting point of the fixed dashboard design, but where you could do things like even just simple things like on a bar chart, swap out which attribute is shown as the breakdown variable across the x-axis, right? Then you can suddenly start to look and explore new things in a little kind of contained sandbox where you can't do things drastically wrong, like pull the wrong information from the database, but you can start to have some flexibility to explore without having to dump out and go into another tool.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about tools, because you're building tools, but you're also using tools. So I would like to talk a little bit about that. But maybe I want to reverse this a little bit with Melanie, and starting with Melanie, which would be, you talked about visualization for human AI. Right? So using visualization as a tool to look into the black box, right? So I would love to hear a little bit more about that. So in the context of tools, and also whether AI can be used on the other side of things to build visualizations themselves. Namely, I work in Tableau, right? And they had some sort of natural language interaction, right?
Yep.
Best. And if I don't know how things are nowadays, I recall that previously things were pretty much hard coded, so that was declarative logic, right? If you say something, do something, and it wasn't super broad, right? Do you think like these new large language models can help us with that sort of things?
Yeah, I do. There's, I think, a huge space of possibilities for visualization plus AI, but I can give you a few examples. One is the natural language interaction with Tableau, which is actually a feature that I worked on when I was there. And the way we implemented the initial version was all very rule-based and declarative. And that was for two reasons. One is that we didn't actually have a corpus of language to pull from as examples of how people would ask questions of their data, right? You got to start somewhere. And you can't run an ML model without having that data to build on. So the first version was going to be this more declarative approach, with the idea that once it's deployed, we could collect enough queries that people would ask that then we could learn from that and we could actually go towards something more flexible. But yeah, I think that there's a huge opportunity there, and the ChatGPT type of large language models can probably do a much better job at interpreting what people are actually asking of their data than what we could do with basically a gigantic if then else collection of rules.
Because if I recall, you also like found out that some people were transitioning or finishing some parts of the job over at Excel, right? Because
We did.
Because it was having like a steep learning curve. Tableau sometimes it had a steep learning curve.
Tableau does have a bit of a steep learning curve, and the reason that we went towards this, exploring this natural language interaction idea, was because of that. We were trying to find a way for someone who is business manager, not an analyst, who wanted to kind of ask and answer questions with their data, but didn't have the time to really get in and learn the desktop tool, that they would have some new mechanism to be able to do that was hopefully lighter weight and easier to grasp.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, another example of AI that we were using was around recommendations in data visualization. So as you're exploring your data, the system can help you by suggesting next steps that you might take, or interesting things in the data, just producing you a sampling of charts, like maybe you want to try this, maybe this, and let you kind of guide your, not so much dictate your analysis, but give you options to pick from.
Did you?
I don't know if everyone wants to answer your question first. There's another question in the chat.
Okay. Let's just finish this round. On the tools, Yvonne. So, yeah, so you build tools that are being used by scientists, or at least the parent group.
Yes.
What sort of resources do you use in the making of those?
Resources like in terms of software or
Tech stack.
tech stack. Okay, so I'm not the correct person to ask about that. No, that would be Ben. You can find us on Twitter.
Sure.
But yeah, it's that in terms of tech, that's Ben and Juyen. I'm more, visual UI prototyping. And then, I tend to try to convince my engineers that having a primary and secondary button scheme is awesome, because those are the kinds of battles I fight every day making the tools. So use the usual Figma, Adobe XD, Illustrator, Photoshop, that kind of stuff. I will jump in and do light coding on the CSS, HTML side every now and again, but I'm more of a visual, like assemble it, show how it works. Please, can we do this? Because people need to know this button is here, that kind of stuff.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
No, that's good. Ben, what are you using in Fathom nowadays? Everything or something?
Everything. I think what as much as possible we try and give people room to, because so many of our projects are really done in 2s and 3s, and then eventually we pull more people into it, so it's grows to 5 and 6 and 7. But we try to have as much as possible, like try and have folks working in ways that are allows them to be fastest to iterate. And so like how what allows them to kind of work in a flexible way that we can, if we're going to try one thing and our initial impression is going to be wrong, and we need to be able to throw that away very quickly and go to the next one and the next one. And so just finding tools that folks are comfortable with. And so for some people, it's going to be just straight vanilla JavaScript all the time, and that they spend a bunch of time doing web development that way. For other folks, we just did a project using Elixir and Phoenix as a whole sort of backend system, because one of the developers was, he was like, this sounds like an Elixir and Phoenix problem, and he's been trying to evangelize it internally. We're like, all right, Kyle, let's go. Let's do it. For myself, I do a lot of munging things around with Python, and then playing with things visually in JavaScript or Java, or kind of depending on what, or doing another really high performance thing for looking at large data sets in C++. So we just kind of makes it very confusing to write, because it's like horns and indents and curly braces kind of jumping between each of them. So yeah, we just try and work as flexibly as possible.
How much do you still use processing in the practice today?
A bit. So processing is often used most by our people who are closest to kind of somewhere caught between code and design, and often as a way to sort of try out some stuff. We have actually the designer who that last thing I showed with the mutations, that was actually developed by one of our designers, all entirely based in JavaScript, and he had started with some processing stuff, and but he was kind of just building that, and it's like, Paul, what are you doing? Like, what's and just and so it's nice to see some of that evolution too, as far as just be able to quickly kind of put things together.
And it's good that there is this sort of flexibility of tools within the practice. Stefania, we have a question online, right?
There's a question. Paolo is asking, how do you or your clients handle maintenance and updates of the tools you develop? And I'll pass this back to you. Maybe we could start with you. Yeah, maybe.
Nobody wants to pay for maintenance. Shocker, right? So with that in mind, what we actually try to do is scope projects in a way that we can do a smaller version of something and then come back and actually do another round. We try and do things that are kind of like all in and self-maintaining enough so that they don't necessarily, it's not part of the business model to keep them doing maintenance with us. But again, as part of that iteration thing, we want to have, let's bite off a piece of the problem. Let's have you use that tool. Once you use the tool, you'll learn things about how you actually want to use it that kind of break up your assumptions that you had going in. So the very first thing I showed, the systems bio piece, we had done, with that model that we did in the initial 12-week engagement, which is the result that you saw there. And then we did a second round, and we said, look, let's do this and come back in 6 months, and we'll, do another round if that's what, if that's what you want to do, and funding wise that works, things like that. The first version was all about, it's all about finding the right pathway through the data, and it's the golden path through, doing this cell and lining up all these things. It's just this one path. Okay, great. Kind of build something around that. And they came back 6 months later, and they're like, so how we said it was one path? It's like maybe a couple paths, like they're kind of branchy. And so kind of had to rip the thing apart. And so basically their baseline sort of interface metaphor was, still kind of working with the path, but needed to go in a very different direction. But that is not something that they could know without having used the tool and sort of seen that in practice. And so again, it's just important to how do you keep things nice and small, and then just try and iterate on it as best we can.
Do you want to answer that? Or?
I'm not the best person to address this.
We run into something. So because we're in an interdisciplinary studio, we do, kind of like those outreach web pages that don't contain a tool, and then like the tools themselves. And so what we've done is for, things that are more so a visual kind of an experience, it sets a stage. We try to build those into a CMS, so then that our clients can go in and update. They're not asking us like, hey, can you remove this paragraph? And then it's like, oh, I want to build a tool. So we have that set up. I can only speak to DepMap. We have a team of engineers. And so, things like updates, maintenance, like that's all done in-house. For the other tools, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, that's kind of how we see maintenance and upkeep. And like if we've built something and we have the end of our scope, and then they want to come back and say, well, we want this other feature, we want this other thing, we write a new contract, and that's a new scope of work. Yeah. Otherwise, you're just going to be in this like doom spiral for forever.
So Ben, to follow up on that, when you hand off, you say, are you like, okay, here you go, you treat them as a product owner, and then there's some training, then.
Well, it depends on the project. Like in the case of the systems bio work, we were working through the last third of the or half a third, so like the final 6 weeks of that 12. They were using versions of it to give us feedback as we were wrapping up. And then when we got to the end, it was all right, now go away and use this. So that's one model. Also, the CMS thing is actually like one of these, as far as a future thing or something that someone needs to solve, build a tool around, whatever. The idea of how you actually do the sort of content management behind these things is a huge thing that we have tried to solve in different ways, and we have not found an ideal way to do that. If it's something that behaves nicely in a CMS, then great. If we might put it in, if it's basic data that can be updated, maybe that's Google Sheets, but as noted earlier, that's like if somebody puts a letter where there should be a number, badness. But that is a huge thing as far as, and even we've turned down a project recently because we felt that it was going to be too much about that ongoing maintenance of it. Or in another case, we put a major investment into doing the ongoing, we did a project about power in China, and for Thomson Reuters, it's big, great big effort, and many months. And we launched the project, and it was banned in China within a couple hours. But also how to say this out loud. So also they were kind of called in and so what's that about? They're like, well, once every 10 years, power transition, et cetera. And they're like, yeah, not so much of that. And so the project itself kind of got set aside a bit, which was tough because we had put in all of this work to like one click, be able to do updates on the minute, hour, daily, weekly, whatever. And so that there was major investment there. And so you just, it's tricky to balance.
Right, everyone, we gotta wrap it up. We're over time. Thank you, everyone, for coming and in applause.
Thank you, everybody. This is fun.